I'd like to welcome everyone to the second hearing of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. Joining us today is a very special guest, Sylvia M. Burwell, American University's 15th president. President Burwell is no stranger to public service, having held 2 cabinet positions among other roles in the U.S. government. She has served as a strong national service advocate during her foundation and nonprofit years. President Burwell brings her experience in advancing solutions to some of the world's most pressing challenges to American University. President Burwell, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for hosting us, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heck, and for the introduction, and to you and all of the commissioners of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, and to all that are in the audience today. I want to welcome everyone to the Washington College of Law at American University. And I'm honored to join you this afternoon and happy to do that, almost as happy as all our students were to have a snow day yesterday. Service has always been close to my heart from my childhood, and I grew up in the Matthews household where commitment to service was basically a prerequisite. And on Halloween, you actually would do 2 rounds of trick-or-treating. The first one was for UNICEF, and then the second one, once you complete that, you could go out again and do the next round for candy. And service was actually why my mother was active in every service, business, community organization, church organization in our community, from 26 years as the president of the Church Women to the Business and Professional Women to every organization in our community. And my father actually belonged to every funny hat group, Lions, Moose, Shriners, everything. My father was a part of that. So that commitment to service has guided me in both my education and my work and trying to create change at scale. And it's actually what led me here to American University. And I don't think you could have picked a more perfect place from our perspective in terms of having this meeting, having this conversation. And service has been at the core of American University for the past 125 years since our founding. And it's actually very true here at the Washington College of Law, where we're sitting as well. From its founding, it's been a place of change makers and people focused beyond themselves in terms of creating a better society. And in 1896, what would become the Washington College of Law, where you now are, was founded by Ellen Spencer Musey and Emma Gillette. And it became the first law school in the world ever founded by women. And it was the first to have a woman dean, and it was the first to graduate an all-female class of law students. And Alice Paul, a name that some of you may know, the famous suffragist, advocated for the 19th Amendment, and the author, she was an advocate for the 19th Amendment and the author of the Equal Rights Amendment. She also studied here at our School of Public Affairs, and supposedly she wrote parts of that as she was a student. And we certainly don't expect all of our students to lead a nationwide movement for a constitutional amendment between classes, but we sure like it when they do. And on our main campus, you may have seen, and if you go over that way, the law school's here, but if you keep going down the grass and you come to the main campus, you'll see our School of International Service. And you'll note the title is not a School of International Studies or International Affairs. It's actually about deeper engagement and an active engagement with the world. As President Eisenhower said when he laid the groundbreaking stone at SIS, we need our best and our brightest young people committed to waging peace. And our university attempts to do that. Our students report more than 60,000 hours of service each year. And you'll find that American University is in the top 5 list of mid-sized schools for the Peace Corps. We're top recruiters for AmeriCorps. And Teach for America, too, in terms of places where we are excited to have lots of our students go. And we have a wealth of students who serve in our nation's military or from military families, which is really important to us. We have students from all branches of the Armed Forces, as well as the NOAA Corps, the U.S. Merchant Marines, and a group I'm particularly familiar with, HHS Public Health Service Commission Corps. And GI Jobs magazine has, for 8 years in a row, called us a military-friendly university. So whether it's military service or other service, we as a university are quite focused on that. Whether you look at service in our military or our nation, we deeply engage and think this is important. And what I've learned from this community of change makers since I've been here, and from my own experience, a few things. First, I learned that service is contagious, and as in Hinton at American University, the spirit of service spreads, and you find it in everything from our annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service, where even though it was the coldest day in DC, we were oversubscribed and had more students than we ever have on our MLK Day of Service, to voter registration drives. And the spirit of service spreads, actually, we believe, by positive peer pressure in terms of making lasting and positive impact on our students as they graduate and then pursue their careers. Second, learning in an era of curated life that we all see on social media, I think service is one of the antidotes. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said more than 60 years ago, all human beings have a desire to belong, to feel significant and important. And the way to solve this problem is not to drown out the ego, but to find your sense of importance in something outside of yourself. To give yourself to that something, and life becomes meaningful. And so I think service opens the door to that kind of meaning, and we really do see that in our students and our community. And finally, at American University, we focus on the future of citizenship, what it means to be responsible, contributing members of our society in our very rapidly changing world. And it calls us to be change makers ourselves, to continuously find new and innovative ways to make a positive, lasting impact on the world. The idea of service has to adapt and change as we learn more about the needs of our society and our changing world. Booker T. Washington famously said, "The best way to lift oneself up is to help someone else." And on behalf of American University and as a fellow citizen, thank you, this commission, for your commitment to lifting up our nation's young people by helping them help others. With that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Heck, and thank you all so much for being at American University, including our other guests, of which I know a number of you. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Burwell. It's an honor to have you join us today to be at American University. Today, the Commission meets to ponder an important question. Should all Americans be required to serve? Our distinguished panel will help us get at this difficult question and explore in greater depth whether all Americans should be mandated to serve in military, national, and/or public service. As we begin the new year, it's important to note that troops from our nation's military forces continue to serve and fight overseas and have endured continuously for nearly 18 years. With the advent of the professional all-volunteer force, a much smaller percentage of Americans serve in uniform, and fewer Americans even know personally an active duty National Guardsman or Reserve Service member. This reality of a responsibility borne by few, combined with the increasing polarization and stratification in today's society, has led many to revive the early notion of universal service. As we traveled around the country and discussed this fundamental topic with experts and everyday Americans, it became clear that many Americans are willing to consider a transformative effort to involve more in service. The Commission has heard a variety of universal service options to encourage or require service of all citizens. Universal service is defined as a transformative effort to involve many more Americans in military, national, and/or public service. These conversations have focused on three approaches. Universal access, making sure that everyone with a desire to serve can do so. Universal expectation, while service stays voluntary, it becomes the norm so that everybody wants to serve. And a universal obligation, where all Americans are required to serve, but have a choice of how they serve. At the same time, we've heard from many Americans who support the idea of service, but oppose making it mandatory. Some believe that a spirit of volunteerism is necessary for service to be effective. Some see mandatory service as a violation of personal civil liberties, and others cite multiple challenges in implementing a national service program. I hope that our panelists will address these important issues as directly as possible in their oral statements and in their responses to Commissioner questions. Let me welcome our panelists. Mr. Doug Bandow is a Senior Fellow of the Cato Institute. Dr. William Galston is the Ezra K. Zilka Chair and Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institution. Ken Hollander is the author of Step Forward America, A Case for a National Service Program, a book laying out the case for mandatory service. And Lucy Steigerwald is the author of Stop Suggesting Mandatory National Service as a Fix for America's Problem, and a journalist and contributing editor to antiwar.com. We thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, let me explain how we will conduct today's hearing. The commissioners have all received your written testimony and it will be entered into the official record. We ask that you summarize the highlights of your testimony in the allotted 5 minutes. Before you, you will see our timing system. When the light turns yellow, you have approximately 1 minute remaining, and when it turns red, your time has expired. After all testimony is completed, we will move into questions from the commissioners. Each commissioner will be given 5 minutes to ask a question and to receive a response, and I ask that the commissioners maintain a 5-minute limit. Depending on time, we will proceed with 1 and possibly 2 rounds of questions. Upon completion of commissioner questions, we will provide an opportunity for members of the public who are in attendance to offer comments, either on the specific topic addressed today, or more generally on the commission's overarching mandate. These comments will be limited to 2 minutes. The light will turn yellow when there are 30 seconds remaining and red when time has expired. We are now ready to begin our panelists' testimony, and I'd like to begin with Mr. Bandow, Senior Fellow of the Cato Institute. Mr. Bandow, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to present my views on the subject. The service is in Americans' DNA. This was commented upon by Lexie de Tocqueville on his famous trip to the United States, where he saw a civic society that did not exist in monarchical Europe. Mandatory national service really is a very different concept, I think, though it's not a new one. Much of the literature on national service reaches back to Edward Bellamy, his famous book, Looking Backward, and especially the William James essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. I think it's something that, in fact, is worth reading, in part to show that the arguments made at that time were radically different from the ones today. If you read William James, his conception of what national service is sounds very alien to what we think of today. There have been a number of advocates of mandatory programs over the years, ranging from Margaret Mead to Robert McNamara, Charles Moscos, Ted Kennedy, John McCain. Others like Harris Wofford and Stanley McChrystal have talked of some of these ideas, proposed, suggested, and offered different ideas. The outcome over the years have always been small programs, voluntary programs, AmeriCorps, Teach America, and such things. I would argue that the idea of a mandatory universal program is in fact a very bad idea. One that I think one of the dangers is it purports to be a panacea where everyone who supports it sees it as solving different issues and different problems. It becomes kind of a universal solution for a variety of ills they see in American society. First, I think we want to be very careful about presuming that American youth in America are so far down that this is the only kind of a program to rescue them, so bad, so selfish, so greedy. The Potomac Institute report back in 1978, of which Harris Wofford was involved, talked about Saturday Night Fever, essentially, of America at that point, 40 years ago with that movie. But of course, we have dangers of exaggerating America's virtues. We also have dangers, I think, of exaggerating America's failings, and we don't want to go overboard when we're discussing those kinds of issues. The second, I think there's extraordinary danger in seeing a program like this as being an element of soul molding. I think the notion that the government is going to be good at turning people into good, to transforming them from selfish to compassionate to a number of other things is rather I'm skeptical of. The issue of values formation is very important. We have issues of family, community, churches, where we've traditionally had values formation. I don't see a massive government program, one that would have 4 to 8 million people, presumably. Roughly 4 million turn 18 every year. I think the spectacle of the comfortable and privileged judging the young and vulnerable and explaining how they are so selfish and need to be taught compassion is one that's more likely to breed cynicism and idealism. While there are, in fact, tasks that I think are unique and special that can be done, are there 4 million, are there 8 million, what do we actually think a program like this would do? And ultimately, do we believe that compulsory compassion is something that really works? I tend to think that compassion is something that does not come through compulsion. Almost all of these issues discuss the whole question of unmet social needs, the vision of 4 or 8 million people doing wonderful things across the country. The question, of course, is what does that mean? Basically, all of these, when the lists come out, and I've seen a number of lists over the years, I remember one that totaled up 5.3 million unmet social needs, 200,000 in libraries, went down the list. And if you ask people if they'd like to have free labor, they can come up with a very large list. The problem is that there's no conception of cost. either direct cost of paying people, et cetera, or the opportunity cost of what they would otherwise be doing. A list of this nature tells us nothing. The question is, what is valued, what is useful, how will these be used, how will organizations use them? We know nothing. So you have to have both costs and benefits to take into account. I think one has to be very careful about using this kind of language. And the question of kind of putting all of this in the public realm, there are lots of forms of service, and it's not clear to me that we want the government defining what appropriate service is. Someone in private medical practice can be very self-sacrificing. Somebody can go on missions trips. Someone can serve. We have a U.S. Senator, an ophthalmologist who goes down to Haiti and does operations on his off time. Service is a multiple out there. People in private sector can do extraordinarily important service. I think there's a danger of baptizing only one sense of service. That ultimately, is it better to shelve books in a library or to shelve books in a private bookstore? It's not clear to me that working in a library itself is uniquely self-sacrificing compared to other uses. Again, the question of free labor, how this is used, how agencies would use this, how NGOs would use this. And I worry that there's an element in which we are continuing a process of giving primacy to state programs where the welfare state tends to push out the independent sector. Within the independent sector now there's government funding, so NGOs are really not non-governmental, but in fact rely on government. And then it's not only funding, but it's going to be volunteers who are going to be provided by government. That we're losing something in the expectation of duty to give money, to be involved in organizations, to assess needs, that people, average folks who may not be able to take out full time, are going to have trouble doing. So I think that we should be very skeptical of the concept of mandatory universal national service.
Thank you, Mr. Benda. Dr. Falston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Heck, Vice Chair Wada, members of the Commission, thank you for this opportunity to offer my thoughts on the appropriate scope of national service. The modern national service movement is more than 3 decades old, and it has scored many remarkable successes. But those of us who were present at the creation of AmeriCorps, for example, must acknowledge that it has fallen short of our aspirations. We hoped that as it grew, it would come to transform the prevailing understanding and practice of American citizenship. We hoped that active citizenship would become the norm, and that all Americans would see that citizenship consists not only in rights to be claimed, but also in responsibilities to be met. We hoped, above all, that national service could help close the widening gap among Americans of different backgrounds, partisan affiliations, and ideological orientations. Little of this, alas, has come to pass. We now face a choice between scaling back our hopes to fit the reality of national service as it now exists, and expanding service to fit the scale of our hopes. I incline toward the latter because I refuse to accept the civic status quo, which I regard as dangerously inadequate, and I doubt that I'm alone in that view. So what should we do? The first step, which is not trivial, is to come as close as we can to what the Commission calls universal access to service for all who desire to participate. In my judgment, the best course would be to quadruple the opportunities AmeriCorps offers each year, a program that engaged 300,000 people each year, which, corrected for population growth was the original conception, would be much more visible than today's program. Today's version, most Americans would know, or at least know of, someone who's performing service. The odds that the program could reshape civic norms would rise significantly. If we had achieved the original vision quickly, I'm not alone in this room in believing that the texture of American civic and political life today might be very different. There's a caveat. The venue matters. I believe that service is most likely to achieve its civic mission when it's performed in diverse groups, that is, in teams. Learning through concrete experience that people whose backgrounds and beliefs are very different can work together to accomplish shared goals is the heart of the lesson that today's service must convey. It's hard for me to see what else can even begin to reweave our frayed civic fabric. When I was younger, I backed service as a universal obligation for everyone. I still do in principle. that I no longer regard it as practical. We simply do not have the resources, human or material, to administer such a system in circumstances other than the kinds of emergencies that call for national mobilizations. So I now support something far less far-reaching, which might be called universal exposure. Here's how it would work. Upon graduating from high school or reaching the age of 18, everyone would receive a randomly generated lottery number based on their date of birth. Out of each annual cohort, a certain portion of the number holders would be selected for service, civilian or military. Those choosing civilian service would receive modest living stipends and would earn funds that could be used to defray the cost of post-secondary education and training or for other approved purposes. And of course, individuals who were not part of the lottery would still be free to volunteer for America or in other service opportunities. By the time young people entered high school, they would know that they might be called upon to serve. They would begin to talk to older siblings, relatives, or counselors about their options, and they would begin to understand that there's more to citizenship than just asserting their rights as individuals. I know that some will raise philosophical or constitutional objections to any mandatory service requirements. I don't share these objections. Citizens are required to serve on juries, and in a national emergency, the selective service system continues to provide the basis for resuming military conscription. Universal exposure to national service is a policy issue, and the arguments for and against it, in my view, are practical, not philosophical or constitutional. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Coulson. Mr. Holliday, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Heck and members of the Commission, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak before you. Why should national service be mandatory? Mandatory service would imply to some that there is a national emergency akin to Pearl Harbor, for example. I contend that we are indeed in the midst of another type of national threat, an existential threat to America as we know it, based on my impression that America no longer warrants the respect that we have always received from both our enemies and our allies, and that we've lost our belief in the American idea. For example, we threaten to abandon our allies who, with us, have been responsible for maintaining the world order in the decades following World War II. We threaten to wall ourselves off from needy migrants escaping persecution, looking for a better life. We have backed out of our commitment to do our share of cleaning up the planet. And perhaps more importantly, we continue to widen the economic and social gap between the upper educated class and the lower poorly educated class. We have become accustomed to addressing our major security problems by turning over the heavy lifting to the very small percentage who serve in the military, those who fight our endless wars while the rest of us, contributing nothing, are not even asked to pay an additional tax to support these efforts. In simple terms, either restore the draft or implement a similar process involving all of us in universal service. The challenges listed in my written testimony cannot be met by merely hoping that all will get on board. I am proposing a traditional military draft in which everyone, with obvious exceptions, on reaching their 18th birthday will register and make a commitment, addressing, of course, any deferrals or exemptions that the program allows. My program is mandatory rather than voluntary for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that a voluntary program would undoubtedly elude those who need it most. There's a lot to pack into my program, and therefore it must be very structured. A mandatory program would be set up so that not only would participation be mandatory, but certain aspects of the program, for example, certain basic training and the education of the type that I propose and that was in my written testimony, would be mandatory. A voluntary program relying on the good intentions of academia, corporate America, and the ingrained functioning of existing institutions cannot ensure the diversity and togetherness that will accomplish the goal of putting young people from different backgrounds together so that they are exposed to different cultures and ideas and thereby learn to tolerate the opinions of others and the need to compromise with others in order to be productive in their endeavors. A good deal of the time for all participants should be spent learning, living, and working together, as opposed to one-off assignments for individuals. The program must have enough control over the assignments to ensure this, whereas in a strictly voluntary program, the individual would, for the most part, be determining the assignment. It would not seem possible that a voluntary program can accurately determine the number of participants and provide the necessary infrastructure, the necessary facilities, and time set aside for the training and education comparable to that in my proposed 2-year mandatory program. A basic training component could probably not be worked into a voluntary program, so a voluntary program cannot reach the goal of improving the readiness of participants to step right into a strict military training in the event of a threatened attack on us or an ally. Considering the values and fairness concerns of the Commission, I conclude the disconnected youth most in need of the experience will participate and benefit. We will not end up with a first class of citizens who have participated and a second class of citizens left behind, thereby further widening the social and economic equality gap. No longer will we expect 1% of Americans to be responsible for our safety and security. No longer will we entrust our social, economic, and political lives to the relatively few dedicated citizens who now serve and govern. Mandatory is not my line in the sand. All we can get is a voluntary program, mandatory program not being politically feasible. I would be very happy if the voluntary program is implemented, and it will surely help turn us around and get us on the right track. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hollander. Mr. Steigerwald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Is it still on? Okay. Chairman Heck and members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to speak today on the question of whether mandatory national service should be considered. I am pleased to be somewhat redundant with Mr. Bandow and say no. To me, mandatory national service is a solution in search of a problem. An 18-year-old has just spent 12 years in school, 18 with their parents. The door to adulthood is opened, and they are urged to step through. Grabbing them by the arm and dragging them to a time and place selected by a bureaucracy will not help them become grown-ups. Teaching them it's time to leave the hopefully loving arms of their parents and make their own choice in life until the government comes calling and commanding is a mixed message at best. When I was 18, I would have reacted to even benevolent force the same way I would react today, with disgust, anxiety, and anger. The best cause I could imagine would turn sour if I were mandated by law to participate in it. How many hand-wringing headlines do we need about kids today before we realize that just like any other human being, they're trying to find their own paths? We believe that younger generations, mine, millennials, and the younger than that, are being infantilized and are permanently stunted and lacking in the skills of adulthood. Why would we advocate for a program that tells them where to go, what to do, and for how long? Noble intentions don't make great policy. More importantly, is a good idea good if it's mandatory. Only individuals make choices. These choices include making families, working and joining civil, social, religious groups. Social pressure from school, work, or family can influence this, but however, the reality is the individual has the first and the final choice. With respect, nobody, not this commission, not any bureaucracy anywhere, knows what's best for anyone else or how they can or should be using their skills or education or personality. There is a lot of talk about a historically polarized America. Forcing groups of people to work together could mandate a certain amount of cooperation purely by necessity. It will not fix the larger problems and the larger questions that arise about race, gender, sex, politics, and everything else in the headlines. A greater purpose is a lovely, subjective thing. Service itself is a subjective thing, and a purpose is not great simply because it involves a large group of people all doing approximately the same thing. More to the point, individuals need to find their own purpose, and when they don't choose nobly, that's okay too. That's their prerogative. To play too many video games and to wonder where they fit into life. If it isn't, what's the point of having a choice or a life of their own? I have to quote my favorite American, Lysander Spooner, the philosopher. Man, no doubt, owes many other moral duties to his fellow men, such as to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, protect the defenseless, assist the weak, and enlighten the ignorant. These are simply moral duties of which each man must be his own judge in each particular case as to whether and how far he can or will perform them. In its most benevolent interpretation, mandatory national service could look like young people working in homeless shelters or hospitals, maybe some of them even enjoying the process. Yet this is still indentured servitude. How will the practical applications work? Will a certain number have to join the military? Will they be given half a dozen choices to where they wish to spend their time? What stake will industries such as healthcare or defense or law enforcement have in the process? Will they lobby for the choicest, strongest, smartest candidates? Will the less impressive be janitors and ditch diggers? I'll let dissenters at future panels speak on the draft, or I will say that the faint possibility of conscription hangs over every young man's head now. So if you stake a claim in a young person's life during peacetime, as this commission is considering, you certainly have them permanently on the hook during wartime or national emergency or any other crisis such as the endless war on terror that the government proclaims. Individuals are not a resource to be picked clean. They will be treated as such under mandatory national service. The government already acts as if it owns people via 1,000 laws and punishments. Mandatory national service would be one great way to show that freedom comes with an asterisk. Your life is your own until the government claims you. You're not an adult until we release you. As Spooner wrote, what we owe to each other is an important question that cannot be answered by government committee. What we owe to the state is easier to answer, nothing. You might argue this contrariness is the kind of immaturity that a program of national service could have remedied. I would argue that this kind of contrariness is the American spirit if such a thing exists. More importantly, it is the human spirit that relishes choice, freedom, and opportunity. That kind of freedom breeds greatness and ordinariness in individuals. Millions of people prove every day that whatever they choose, however their lives go, they should remain their own simply because they are no one else's.
Thank you all for your testimony. We'll now begin commissioner questioning. I'll put myself on the clock for 5 minutes. As Dr. Ralston had mentioned in his comments, many say that with rights come responsibilities. Some would say that service to one's country should be an obligation of citizenship. I would ask each panelist if they agree or disagree with that statement and why or why not.
Well, I believe there are obligations and responsibilities which come with citizenship, but I believe there's a very real difference between civil or civic service and military service. Military service is to the state, to the institution, to the nation, to the sovereign. So, cleaning bedpans helps people. Shelving books in a library helps people. I don't view it as being an attribute of sovereignty, an attribute of the state, an attribute of the nation. And I think it's very dangerous to draw that sense of responsibility so broadly as to assume that the state has that kind of ability, that kind of power to levy that and make that as a claim of responsibility. The one Supreme Court case that we have on conscription was 1918 and focused very much on the notion that Congress had power to raise an army and that this was an attribute of sovereignty, clearly something very different than I think we're talking about with civilian service.
Dr. Ralston?
Well, I can answer your question straightforwardly in the affirmative without drawing a bright line between military service and civilian service. I think the idea of a political community as a collective enterprise for mutual well-being, where we give and we get, the heart of a viable community being reciprocity. My fear right now is that we are much more experienced at getting than we are in giving. We are much less conscious of the need for some reciprocal balance between giving and getting. And I see service as one way of reinforcing reciprocity without violating either moral principles or constitutional restrictions.
Thank you. Mr. Hollander?
Yes, I see.
Mr. Hollander, can I ask you to speak into the mic?
I see the need for civilian and military service, civilian or military service, equally. The country relies on a strong military force for our security, and we've always had that. Sometimes, at different times, it's been more important, if you will, because the threats have been greater. Right now, the threats are extremely great, both from foreign states and non-state entities. So I feel that for everything that this country gives us, the security that it gives us, the opportunities that it gives us, that everybody should be willing and enthusiastic about giving back. And I would say, even if we had a military draft, if we were all military and no civilian service, and I'm not recommending that, that I would still feel the same way. For example, in Switzerland, obviously, Israel and whatnot, I think their mandatory or relatively mandatory military service requirements are very sound and what helps make both of those nations great. So I would just say, in short, I feel very grateful to what the country has to offer. We have a lot of problems right now. Fortunately, we are able in our country to stand up and complain about those problems. That's one of the greatest benefits that we get from the country, and I think we all should pay back.
Ms. Idle?
I think you kind of already got my answer, but I'll say, no, I don't think that we owe anything. All human beings owe to one another is non-coercion, and everything else has to be up to them, or civil institutions without a government bureaucracy.
Thank you all for your responses. Vice Chair Wada.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panel, for being here today. I guess my first question is to Dr. Galson and Mr. Hollinger. If the thought of universal obligation was put into place, part of the issue in the past has been, particularly with the draft, was in terms of fairness, transparency, and equity. And so how would you address sort of those kinds of concerns that if we were to mandate service, we would be able to address those concerns that were raised?
Well, as it turns out, I have some direct experience with that very issue. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran, and I was exposed to the military draft. And I could spend hours talking about the imbalances, inequities, loopholes in that system, the ability for people with resources, material resources, access to legal representation that others less fortunate didn't have. And it helped to undermine the felt legitimacy of the military conscription system in the United States. And if I thought that a national service program, broader in scope than one we now have, was going to replicate those inequities, I would be against it at all. And as I said, if I had another hour or two, I could walk you through in great detail what
I don't think the
Mr. Hollinger, please.
yes, I don't think the problem is in that the way is not a draft or a requirement per se. In the past, as Dr. Galson has said, there have been problems with the way we implemented a mandatory service. Abuses in the exemptions and so on and so forth. Those abuses can definitely be corrected, whether we're talking about military service or civilian service. And as I said before, when we're talking about values and fairness, I just go back to what I said in my oral presentation. The disconnected youth in need of the experience will participate and benefit. We will not end up with a first class of citizens who have participated and a second class of citizens left behind. And that addresses the fairness issue, I think. And as far as the values, our country is founded on the values of freedom, tolerance for others, equality of opportunity, liberty. And when we put all our youngsters together, I know from my experience in the service, living and working and training together with people from all backgrounds, that it was a very important experience, and everybody began to feel they were part of the American team.
Well, I have time, so I'm going to ask Mr. Van Steiger-Walls. My apologies. I don't want to leave you out. There's concern about those who, obviously, we have heard barriers to service for particularly certain communities and opportunities. And one way to address that is mandatory service. So that requires, gives everybody the ability to be exposed to service. So what are your thoughts in terms of those communities and those individuals who are often denied through no fault of their own the opportunities for service.
You want to start?
I mean, I appreciate the nuances Mr. Bando has drawn about the nature of service and how it's too vague, too broad, according to this panel. I just fundamentally think that there's something wrong, pardon me, with the question when you're saying people don't have the opportunity to provide a service, so let's make them. There's a flaw there, and I can't get around that.
If one is concerned about providing opportunities, I don't understand how a mandatory universal program would be the answer. I think we have, part of this comes back to design. If we're talking about mandatory service, presumably it's compulsory. If it's compulsory, it has to have some punishment for failing to participate. Now, if that punishment is simply you don't get some cash to go to college, then it's kind of like the draft in the Civil War where you just pay your way out. If you're wealthy, you don't have to pay, you don't care, your parents will pay your way to school. If we're really talking about a compulsory program, we're talking about ultimately, presumably, throwing people in jail if they don't show up. So then the question is, you're denied an opportunity, so we're going to threaten you with jail unless you participate in the opportunity we want you to participate in. And I just think, how does one design a program with 4 or 8 million people, decide where they go, give them equal places to go? How do you equalize going to the military and non-military? You can go fight in Fallujah, or you can go shelve books in a library. Which you get. A lot of foreign systems have, say, 3 years civilian, 2 years military to try to equalize. If you do that, military officers typically will run screaming from the room. They want longer-term service because you train people, they're responsible, you use that knowledge. One of the great virtues of the volunteer military is soldiers want to be there. And the military wants that because they're better. I mean, there's a lot of things that go with that. So the moment you move to compulsion, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes in. And I have trouble imagining what this fair system will be. What happens to the malingerer? Okay, yeah, I'll show up at noon every day for my service job. What do you do? I mean, we may wish that they would understand this is a fabulous opportunity we have generously provided for them. They might not see it that way. So, I mean, I think to me that's the challenge here is we should have no illusions. If you're talking about millions of people being compelled to do things, many of which they probably don't want to do. You've entered into a vastly different realm than AmeriCorps and other programs which are relatively small, relatively targeted, that are appealing to people who definitely want to be there. These are radically different worlds, I think.
Mr. Barney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been previously noted that there's a spirit of service that is very strong already in our nation, with many people who do serve. And as we're talking about mandatory service and the possibility of an option of mandatory service, then it's appropriate for us to consider what the consequences are. And Mr. Bando, you've referred to some of them as well. My question is for the panel, and perhaps Ms. Steigerwald, we could start with you. If we were to have a system of mandatory service, what would the likely impact be to those people who currently volunteer and those organizations that require on volunteers for service? Would it tend to perhaps increase participation rates? Would it take away from those? Your thoughts, please.
That's actually a very interesting question. I mean, I guess if you're mixing people who want to be where they are, who are passionate about, say, working in healthcare or literature or ditch digging, adding people who don't want to be there, the malingerers, as Mr. Bando said, I don't think you can fully predict the results. So I'm not really comfortable with that because fundamentally making millions of people do something is saying, I know how well this will work out and let's do it. I think it does diminish, it deeply diminishes the spirit of charity and volunteerism if it's compelled. I don't even think it's the same thing.
Thank you. Mr. Holland.
I've wrestled with that same problem, and with a mandatory program, at least at the outset, I would not recommend imprisonment or severe criminal penalties. I think the penalties that those who talk about a voluntary service have thought about making the participant ineligible for certain government benefits might help discourage those people and would be sufficient punishment, at least at the outset, in the beginning of any program that we set up. As time goes by, we hope this will be more than just voluntary, that a culture of wanting to serve, or feeling that we must serve, that we must give back to our country. And once we get to that point, when the culture is really ingrained in our people, then I think we can treat it like a military draft, and if a youngster or any youngster refuses to serve, then I think they would have to pay the penalty. That could be imprisonment.
Thank you, Dr. Dawson.
Mandatory service of any kind has frequently been characterized as a solution in search of a problem. I disagree, and let me tell you why. This is the consequence I'm particularly concerned about. As I look at our civil and civic life and political life today, what I see is a level of division, polarization, mutual mistrust and antipathy between and among groups of citizens at a level that I haven't seen previously in my lifetime, in which there's good reason to believe that people who are even older than I am have not seen in their lifetimes. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we live our lives increasingly in hermetically sealed micro worlds, occupied principally by people who think like us, who look like us, who act like us, and who share the same perspective and understanding. The virtue and consequence of group-based service, as I've described it, is to bring people together across those differences, as happened during World War II. We've all seen those MGM pictures with, a Pole and an Italian, and a Jew and an African American. African Americans sometimes, but of course the services were not very much integrated during those days. But we've seen those pictures, and there was some real sociology in back of those pictures, right? People who had worked together, who had shared burdens.
Was that many people came from very isolated communities, and second, the intensity of military service and that kind of bonding, it is not the same. I think as you're going to get out of a 4 million or 8 million person program of civilian, will people live in barracks or are they going to live in their homes? Are we talking about a civilian program that will actually take people off, or are they going to live with their families and live among friends and live in apartments? None of these things, I think, we're presuming virtues, we're kind of picking from out there. I doubt this program would give it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I value, pardon me, very highly the experiences and the expressions of our distinguished panel. Several of you have referred to foreign countries. And the question I have is there something from which we can learn from those countries that have mandatory service? And to what extent should we value or not value those?
I'll take a shot at that one. I think we can learn from the situation in Israel, that if we have a mandatory requirement, in their case it started off as mandatory military, I believe, that we must be very careful to avoid the abuses. This has been, from what I read, a serious problem over the past recent years in Israel, that their mandatory requirement has been abused, and there's a crossover between an exemption for religious reasons and an exemption for purely personal reasons, or an exemption for no reason. Those lines have apparently have become blurred, and I'm not sure exactly what's being done, but I know the country's addressing it. I would say that the real poster child is Switzerland. I've never heard anyone say anything derogatory about the program that the Swiss have, and they've had it for virtually forever. Now, to be sure, they are, a peaceable country. They have not connected in the Second World War, for example, with either side. But they all feel that men anyway, feel that they have an obligation to their country, to keep their country strong. They all have a military service requirement. Theirs is spread over, not over just a few years, but over most of the years of their life, where they do a little bit here, a little bit there, and so on and so forth. I have the statistics in my book, but I don't really recall the details. So I think that we can really get something positive about a mandatory program, and I think we can avoid the drawbacks.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I think the difficulty in assessing that is most other countries have mandatory military programs as opposed to mandatory civilian programs. And I mean, the Swiss, it's a national defense measure. It's historically been one, surrounded by enemies, the same thing with Israel. There are social impacts that the focus and the intent is for national security. And you see that in many other countries. A country like Germany has social service as an alternative, had as an alternative to military, but the core was always military. And there they have the problems that then the social service agencies lobbied for conscription because it gave them free labor. So I think it's hard to, most of these are not systems of the sort that we're talking about here, a mandatory universal civilian program. They're based on military, and the social might come on top in terms of alternative service. South Korea has been struggling with this. Do you allow conscientious objection and stuff? So a lot of these issues are floating around, but their core issue is military.
Just a brief comment on Israel, a system I know pretty well. In fact, although the official umbrella for the Israeli system is military, an enormous amount of what occurs under that umbrella takes the form of what we would call civilian service. A lot of language instruction for new immigrants, for example, is performed by young Israelis who've been subject to the draft, etc. So to some extent, this is a distinction without a difference. What I have noticed in Israel is that a lot of young people who emerge from this experience have a kind of seriousness, a kind of maturity that most of our young people, I think, lack. And in addition, there is a sense of having shared a common civic experience. And if I may be permitted an editorial note, I find it very troubling as a citizen that so few of our elected representatives have any direct experience of the military whose votes they direct. I think the quality of our public life would be a lot higher if the share of veterans in the Congress of the United States were significantly higher than it now is. And if we continue to have the system that we now have, the chances of that, I believe, are remote, and I think that is a problem for the country.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Davidson.
Thank you all for coming today and sharing your thoughts. I want to reverse order here a little bit from the mandatory thing, and the vision of our commission. We have a vision statement, and it's for every American inspired and eager to serve. And I'm wondering if each of you could comment on whether that's even a good goal. I mean, I think some of you have already expressed that it's a valuable enough goal that maybe it should be mandatory, but even if it weren't mandatory, every American inspired and eager to serve.
It's such an improbable goal that I find, yes it is, and I am not a libertarian, although I'm surrounded by libertarians, but I have to concede, that kind of uniformity of sentiment is not realizable in the real world, and even in circumstances of World War II, where people streamed to volunteer for military service before they were even drafted, there were a lot of people whose spirit of service was, shall we say, peak. And I don't think that there's anything about a good country that requires that kind of universality of civic sentiment. And I can't think of an educational system that would produce it. I can't think of a feasible social system that would produce it. I think the most we can have is a more widespread sense of reciprocity than we now have. But I wouldn't want the commission to think that it had failed if it did not end up recommending programs that might arguably achieve that goal, because I don't think it's achievable.
I think whether it's a goal or not, I think it's very important. I think it is a vision that we should have, and surely we probably never quite reach that, and many visions are never reached, and yet the effort to get there is important, and in making that effort, we achieve at least part of our goal. I think if we start off with something less, then we're not going to get to the point where we want. I think we should shoot for the moon, if you will. Yes, make that a vision. I think this program, once it starts up, and like any program of this nature, is going to have a lot of stumbling blocks as we go along the first few years, or maybe even the first generation. But I think there's enough good in either a mandatory program or a voluntary program that the country will grab onto this. As I say, it may take as much as a generation, but the country will grab onto it. It will go viral, to use a term that we see often now. And I think the vision is very well worth pursuing.
So, Ms. Steigerwald, Mr. Bando, putting aside whether or not it's feasible or starry-eyed, is it a valuable thing for our society to have more Americans inspired and eager to serve?
Well, I look at, there's a very real difference between moral responsibility and civic responsibility. We live in community with one another. I mean, we all, or almost all of us, certainly live in families and communities, and we go to churches, we have friends. So to my mind, these are concentric rings of responsibility, but they start inward and move out. I mean, we have very strong responsibilities to our own family members, and those around us, those we have a lot of contact with, those we have intimate relationships with. And I think these are very powerful moral relationships, but in the main, they're not ones that can be compelled. And it strikes me that that's where, to my mind, where so much of what we talk about national service is, it's service to others, it's helping others. And I think the mistake is to assume that it can only be full-time for some kind of agency under government aegis. To me, that's where, part-time volunteerism comes in. Working through your church, helping out, and a whole host of stuff out there. So my mind is, I'd love to have a universal ethic within our society in which people recognize obligations to one another and try to live them out. And their ability to live them out is going to depend heavily on their own circumstances. Now, you have heavy family obligations, you probably can do less. And just some of these things out there, and we need to teach it, we need to model it. I mean, those who promote programs like this, need to be the ones who are the best at kind of showing why it's good. But the idea that it becomes a political obligation is where I think we want to be very, very careful. And to my mind, that's where the military is very different. I mean, I think the volunteer military is the way to go. I mean, my nephew's a SEAL. He chose to be there. This is a man of extraordinary accomplishment who wants to be there, and I'm glad he is because he's very good at it. The volunteer military gives us a lot in terms of security, and I think that volunteerism helps. What we want to do is have a system in which there are a lot of variety of outlets for service through which people can live. We shouldn't presume there's only one. And I think the idea of mandating it turns it around. To me, there are moral obligations. That is not itself the same as having political obligations that are going to be imposed.
Ms. Steigerwald, do you want to respond?
Oh, sorry. We're out of time. I echo Mr. Bando, but I also, as usual, but I also think that, again, I hate to, imply that your whole reason for being here is flawed, but I guess that's why I'm here. military, national, and public service to me is there's that you're putting an odd hat on very disparate things. And if, say, my tax dollars were going to a mandatory program, I would obviously have an objection to the mandatory nature, but I also say it was this widespread, inspired, optional, but let's encourage everybody type of service. I would rather fund, the young people in the working in homeless shelters or helping immigrants, and I would rather not fund the military or, things that I think might increase government. And so, again, this generalizing of service is vague, but you're trying to put a federal bureaucracy hat on something that doesn't fit under it.
Ms. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for sharing your time with us this afternoon and your views. I'd like to start with Ms. Steigerwald. You argued in your testimony and again today that mandatory service would be an infringement on personal liberty. However, I think as was mentioned before, currently folks in this country are required to serve on juries, they're required to pay taxes. We live by a set of established laws for the common good. So can you talk about what makes mandatory service different from these requirements that are already established as mandatory?
That's a good one. If you ever talk to a libertarian, you can find one who would, be able to argue against mandatory jury calls. But more to the point, I have yet to hear a suggestion from this commission that doesn't sound grand. And yes, a jury can be sequestered for months if it's some dramatic, giant trial, but that's something that, I would argue that you could find people to serve on juries, and the selection process that we have right now is rather flawed in that way. But you're talking about a year of someone's life, and it's just a more extreme example of something that I fundamentally do not believe in. I think you do need people to commit crimes, and you need some way to deal with that fact, and the jury seems like a pretty good one, but people, are generous and they help others and they do join the military and do all sorts of other things. And the idea that the compulsion is needed is just, it's not based on anything substantial. It's just, you guys are trying to find something to do.
So if I could continue on that line, you mentioned that it's a year of someone's life. One of the other recommendations or discussions, ideas that have been brought forward to us is to make some sort of service a part of your school time. So for example, perhaps a semester of your high school is required for a service learning option. How would you feel about something along those lines, that it would be instead of a year of someone's service where you're taking them out of their choices of what to do with their life, it's part of a school program?
Well, high school students they're not independent adults, and have some problems with some of the way they're treated by public schools. I think that's a lesser, not as problematic suggestion. And the idea that, high school students should be more out in the world, out of the classroom, is a good one. But this idea that service is this apolitical thing that's always going to be good, it's still faulty. What are they going to be doing? Are they going to be, helping build sanitation in Appalachia, or are they going to be learning that it's their job to be part of the collective military force? I don't know. This sort of program is a generalization, but it also defies the ability to predict what it would look like, because it's such a wide, sweeping idea that would affect millions of people's lives, no matter what it looked like.
Thank you. Mr. Hollander, the mandatory service program that you envision includes education, a list of education requirements such as civics and personal finance and media literacy. I'm curious to know why you think these skills should be included or learned through a service program as opposed to through our current education system.
I think it would be ideal were it sufficiently part of our existing system, but I think we're seeing that for the most part, those lessons in living, if you will, as I described them in my testimony and in my book, those lessons are not really being learned in secondary education, in primary and secondary education. We are getting exposure to the liberal arts, we're getting exposure to science, we're learning, the basic 3 R's and so on and so forth. In technical schools, we get technical training to develop the skills that goes into one of the trades, but that section of learning that we all need badly doesn't seem to fit in any part of our existing situation, the existing secondary and primary school situations. To be sure, it is being taught in some, but I don't think it's general enough. The focus on civics, I think that goes without saying, that the more we know about our government and our history and our Constitution, the better informed we are of those, the better off we, our youngsters and all of us, will be to make decisions and to evaluate political decisions and so on. But I think we're finding that a lot of the youth, when they get out of high school, when they drop out of high school, when they complete high school and graduate and then go on, or even when they get into college, when they get out into the free world, they run into a lot of roadblocks. The obvious one would be the college graduate who didn't realize what was going on over the past 4 years as he was developing increasing debt over those 4 years. Gets out of college and realizes, whoa, what am I going to do now? Not only do I find it difficult getting a job, but for every day that I don't go to work, the costs are adding up. And they end up with this unmanageable college debt. Or they get into a situation where they start to build a family perhaps and have no idea what's involved in supporting a family. I just mean primarily the financial supporting aspects of it. And they don't have any idea about insurance and health care and finances, what to do with their savings, how much to save, and so on and so forth. If we look at the American population right now, as I understand it, the amount that's saved for retirement, I don't have the specifics in my mind because I'm not very good on those details, but I know it's very inadequate for the average person up there working in their 40s and 50s and whatnot. The average person has not put aside anywhere near what they need to do for retirement. These are lessons that should be learned early in a career, because if you don't learn them until too late in the career, it is indeed too late.
Thank you. Mr. Kogan.
Thank you all for being here. This is a great discussion. I'm very happy that you all are here to help us through this. Dr. Galston, I wanted to pose a question to you, please. I was interested in what you see as the compelling need for the mandatory service program. In an earlier answer, you were talking about the injury to social fabric and the idea that we're not getting along, we're not as connected as we used to be. And what I've heard as we've gone around the country and talked to people is that there is the need for service programs are a practical need. We have a military because we need to win a war. We have a police force because we need to neutralize a threat or clean up after disasters. And a benefit of serving in those is that we come together in ways we hadn't before. But in your answer previously, you seem to indicate that the primary reason for service was that connectedness. Did I misunderstand that?
Well, thank you very much for that question, which I think is an important one. First of all, there's no question about the fact that if service is not directed towards meeting an important and otherwise unmet need, then it's not worth doing. And if service is not worth doing, then people, especially young people whose BS detector is quite acute, I've noticed, will see that quickly. And they'll see through the program. So the presupposition of everything that I'm talking about is that there is a very wide range of unmet needs in our society. I was actually focusing on the distinction between individuals going off and doing service on their own, as opposed to the format that I stressed in my remarks, namely doing it together. Because in my view, on top of all of the individual unmet needs that we have in our society, we also have an overarching civic and political problem. And that is our inability to deal in terms of respect and compromise with a very fragmented society made up of a lot of people who seem very alien and distant from one another. So on top of meeting needs, there is also, and I'm being very blunt about this, a civic and political objective to the idea of group service involving people who are very diverse and who might not spend a lot of time with each other afterwards or in any other way. But making up opportunities for people to have kumbaya experiences is not what I'm talking about. But that has to be, but coming together across our differences has to be one of the consequences of the kind of service we need now, I think, more than we needed it 30 years ago.
Mr. Honger, I wanted to ask you, in your testimony, you talk about the need for a mandatory service program. And one of the reasons you stress is that the reason it should be mandatory instead of voluntary is that if it were voluntary, those who would most benefit from it would not partake in it. I mean, there are a lot of activities that individuals would benefit from, exercise, a healthy diet, regular attendance at religious services. Should those be mandatory as well?
Well, it probably should. No. I think, those problems are not quite the same, because the problems that I mentioned, and there are some crossovers, the problems that I mentioned have a direct cost to society. Let's take the extreme cases in the inner cities, where the underprivileged, those who are left behind and struggle, make their own way, make bad decisions, and a certain element of those who do not have the same opportunity, the same financial resources, if you will, or the same education opportunities that most of us, the rest of us have. They're struggling, and they turn to, understandably, a lot of behavior that has very bad social costs. Criminal behavior. Extreme examples would be somebody who joins a terrorist group. Others, drug trafficking, human trafficking, drug use. You know, you can go on and on of the difficulties that arise in the underprivileged areas, because those who live and toil there don't have the opportunities that the rest of us have. And so I see the difference being the social cost. Obesity, for example, or lack of exercise or poor diet, doesn't turn you into a poor citizen, really. But if you are resorting to very antisocial behavior in an inner city situation, I don't think it's unfair to say you are being a bad citizen.
Mr. Casey?
Thank you all for sharing your views and your experience so articulately and passionately. It's been very helpful. I want to start with asking Dr. Golston a question. I appreciated what you said about you were one of the architects of the creation of AmeriCorps, and that it hasn't lived up to the original aspirations. The good news is we have had 30 years of the modern national service movement, as you said, and it now does have, at least at the AmeriCorps level, smaller scale, strong bipartisan support, as witnessed by the past two years of the Republican Congress funding this program, even with small increases. Reflecting back, and now we're at a different stage, and I think you're right about an even greater need. What can we learn from those lessons from the creation that if we, as a country now, try to embark on a renewed commitment to national service, that we can have a better chance of success this time?
Well, as I'm sure you'd be the first to agree, we shouldn't undervalue what we've achieved, even though the civic consequences have been somewhat disappointing. I mean, what I learned, and I was part of a small team in the White House that helped to put it together and sell it to a divided and reluctant Congress. People are always going to be of many minds about the idea of service, particularly when it's publicly sponsored and funded. As I think we've seen from today's panel, that diversity of viewpoint has by no means disappeared in the 30 years since the modern national service movement began. And we've also learned that there are many competing fiscal needs, even if the importance of service is granted in principle. And so it turned out to be even more difficult to get appropriations for AmeriCorps than it was to get it authorized in the first place. The fiscal pressures haven't diminished either. I personally believe that we have learned that scale matters, and I think that the original aspiration, for 250,000, which corrected for population growth to be in the neighborhood of 300,000 today on an annual basis, made a lot of sense because it would have created a situation in which there was a much wider, a tipping point would have been reached. There would have been much wider consciousness of service opportunities throughout the political community, and particularly among young people. I would say to the Commission as a whole that setting aside the issue of mandatory versus voluntary, if you were able to create an agreement across partisan and ideological lines for a dramatic expansion of the kinds of programs that have already proved their worth and their workability over the more than a quarter of a century, that would be a substantial achievement. I've given you my reasons for believing that a mandatory component would yield additional civic benefits that are appropriate to the times in which we now live. But I would throw my hat in the air if you did something less than that, but much more than what we're now doing.
Mr. Van Dam and Ms. Steigerwald, you've made very articulate, passionate arguments against a mandatory program, which is very thoughtful. How do you feel if it's not mandatory, but if we had a system that was voluntary, would provide, we had a previous panel where a lot of the folks talked about just the crushing student debt crisis for young people, for example. One that provided not exactly the same as the GI Bill, but we have a GI Bill for people who do military service, but we had a system where people could earn even more than right now, which is a Pell Grant, essentially. After a year of service, people get Pell Grants without, just based on eligibility. What would you think about a voluntary system that had some incentives for young people who decided totally on their own to choose to serve their country, non-military?
Well, of course, that's a less objectionable suggestion. I think that there are other solutions to student debt that I would love to see explored. people in need, which is what I care about, charity needs that need to be met, that kind of thing can be remedied by considering getting rid of some laws, restrictions on being able to have your own soup kitchen or homeless shelter or what have you. There are small, clever solutions beyond this grand planning again. I have less to rant about when it comes to your suggestion, but I'm not comfortable with the idea of sort of, I'm blanking on what the word universal, I guess is what it was, sort of an aggressive campaign and sort of schools full of sort of endless mandate, volunteer, volunteer, volunteer. Simply telling people what's available now, what they could be doing, talking in a class about helping people, like people, not the nation, not civic responsibility. Talk about people you know who might need help, people in your neighborhood who don't have all the things they need. I mean, the problem is not this lack of civic anything, it's that there are people, even in this country, who don't have things they need, and there are people doing, a lot of lovely, generous people who do things about that. And encouraging young people to be also doing something about that is great, but that's all. That's all.
Well, certainly a voluntary program of any sort, I think, is far better than a compulsory program. I worry a bit against the sense that it becomes the answer to everything, which is there are a lot of issues out there where I think the fundamental problems lie elsewhere. I mean, the whole issue of financing, there's a lot of evidence that the influx of student aid encourages tuition increases. Colleges and universities are quite aware of their ability to pay. In one study I've seen suggests that every $1,000 in extra student aid yields $600 increase in tuition. So I mean, if you're concerned about the affordability of college, the question is the way to do that to throw more money into it, and then kind of create an obligation now to, so students can get more money, we create obligations, kind of a bootstrap that I prefer to look backward originally. I think there are an awful lot of areas of healthcare and other things where we have extraordinary problems. The question is, does a program like this, say let's have 1 million volunteers, is that a good answer? In essence, you're throwing untrained people at problems. Or does it make more sense to target narrowly? If we have the money, should we have a particular program in terms of, oncology and people? I mean, some of these I think are extraordinarily important. It's not clear to me that, again, I think we're marrying this desire to encourage service by young people, which is a good thing. Plus, well, let's do some good stuff at the same time. And I also think the idea of federalism is very important. I mean, Ms. James' question about high school, requiring service. My reaction is schools should be relatively independent, be able to make requirements that they want. But I'd be very hesitant to say, let's have the Federal Department of Education try to mandate, or Congress try to mandate that every high school in America do this. To me, this is the kind of thing you, in a diverse country of 330, 340 million people, 50 states, multiple communities, let people make those choices, let them experiment. So to me, the more you ratchet up, I'd like to see more experimentation, more local and state level. I prefer to see, that kind of thing as opposed to let's have a federalized approach and a macro program.
Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one is for Dr. Galston and Mr. Hollander as proponents of universal service. What's your appreciation as to what a mature, some degree of early attainment of maturity with the universality of service, what that does, what you conceive that would do to the economy? I think Mr. Hollander, you talked about, pardon me if I got this wrong, talked about that there be some lessons and some failures on a path to growth to establishing some type of universal service. What are your appreciations of what injecting this period of universal service for several million Americans a year would have on the current path of our economic growth?
Your question is what it is going to do for the country as a whole, as opposed to what it does for the individual serving. Is that, do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, the economy as a whole, when you take 4 million people out of it in some form or fashion, whether that includes how you pay for it, but what it does.
I think the most important thing that it does is it brings up the level of knowledge and understanding of what goes on in the country, why each individual's social situation, economic situation, political situation is what it is, and it brings, as Dr. Dawson said, the togetherness, gets everybody on the same plane, understanding the opinions of others. Sitting right here, I'm having the opportunity, obviously, to understand the opinions of others, of those who don't agree with me. I think that's very, very important, and it's got to start at a young age. Youngsters in high school are already, they're already influenced by what's going on before, by their primary education, by their parents, maybe by their church, maybe by their friends, some of whom are not a good influence on them and whatnot. So I think we've got to get the young, not necessarily turned around, but more attuned to what makes a good society, what makes a good economy, of course, what makes a good society, what makes a good citizen. And I think if everybody realizes that, after a certain amount of time, certainly with a program like this, and then continuing on into more education or into the labor force with this background, we build up a society of caring individuals who will help make this country great and help overcome the problems that I discussed in my written testimony, and the problems that I discussed in Step Forward America.
Thank you, sir. Doctor.
You've asked a very interesting question. To be honest, I haven't thought through before. So let me do something very dangerous, and that is think out loud while I'm rehearsed on C-SPAN. And let me try to answer your question in more strictly economic terms, which I think you intended. As I think most of us are aware, norms of participation in the paid workforce among adolescents and young adults have changed very dramatically in the past 2 generations. And now the norm, statistically at any rate, is that you will not be in the paid workforce full time until you're significantly older than was the case in the 1940s and in the 1950s. So now let me speculate. Under the kind of program that I favor, young people doing a year of service would earn a living stipend and also credits towards post-secondary education and training. Quite possibly, that would make it more likely that they would finish up their post-secondary education and training on time and with less debt than they would have otherwise. That would have a range of economic consequences. I can also imagine the sort of thing that one sees in Israel, that if you enter college or post-secondary training when you're a little bit older as opposed to straight out of high school, you'll be more serious about it, more likely to put one step in front of the other and finish on time. That too would have beneficial economic consequences. And so I think on the one hand, you would have a certain number of people withdrawn from even membership in the paid labor force for that year. On the other hand, you might get compensated or more than compensating returns from improved college completion rates and lower student debt. I don't know how to do the sums, so I haven't unrehearsed, but it's not clear to me that it's a slam dunk dead weight loss for the economy. Not at all.
I appreciate you working without a net, Doctor, and I yield back to Chad.
That concludes the first round of questions. We'll now move into the second round. For the second round, I would please ask both the commissioners and the panelists to be more cognizant of the time clock in respect of everybody's time here today. I will defer my next questions and recognize Vice Chair Watt.
Mr. Banda, I just wanted to, in your testimony, your written testimony, you talk about you could support a military draft because it's directed managed by state for the benefit of the state. So if we were, as you know, or you may know, the Army's having difficulty last year meeting recruiting requirements. The propensity for young Americans to serve in uniform is declining even greater. If there came a time where we required all Americans of a certain age to serve in the military, what would your position be then?
I want to be very clear, I'm not an advocate of the draft. My time in politics
was about to be proposed.
Exactly. I worked for Ronald Reagan in the White House under Martin Anderson, who was the father of the all-volunteer military. A man who I greatly admired, his position I greatly admired. Look, what I would say on the draft is the only argument for mandatory service of any kind, it strikes me as a national security emergency. I don't see any argument that can justify civilian mandatory service. Because I think it's an element of necessity. The question is your society under threat? And that's the critical issue, and in American history, when has that threat been met? In my view, it's pretty hard to find that. I know, for example, World War I, if we wanted to have a prudential argument, I would argue nothing there would require conscription. It's not that kind of a threat. And so what I would argue is that if you see this extraordinary need, then you can make the argument for military conscription. To me, that's the only case you can make for military conscription. What I would say is that on any circumstance that we are living through today, number one, conscription almost certainly will not help you, in the sense that the military does not want to conscript military. People who do not want to be there have indiscipline problems. They want out. They don't want to stay in. They don't want longer terms. They don't want to train. The whole tenor of military service is radically different. People want out as opposed to want to stay in. So military officers remember what it was like before. My father was one. He served under both in the draft military and afterwards. So that would not be good. And especially, let me say, if we're doing stupid wars, nation building, spending 17 years bringing democracy to Central Asia, trying to do things that I don't quite understand in foreign countries, and civil wars with multiple parties, I don't see how on earth one can justify conscripting young men, and now women. I mean, if we're going to have women in combat arms, one would have to conscript women as well as men. So to me, and this is a question, where is the necessity? We have to be able to argue that whatever that current need is significant enough. And to me, that's where we have to go the other way and say, wait a minute, to draft somebody into military conditions where they fight and die, to risk their lives, and to risk kind of what it brings to our society, 4,500 dead out of Iraq, tens of thousands injured, some very severely. What did that, what was the price that we paid? So I would say that conscription is a very last resort. And I don't see any current circumstance and any current threat that could justify that. One, the military has a problem on recruiting, and now that would be exacerbated, I would argue, by a civilian program. Because suddenly there's a new service alternative with money for college. The military is no longer unique. It's competing with programs that provide easier service yet similar benefits. That one I think the military would view as a problem.
In the interest of time, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. You're still running a deficit. Mr. Barney.
Thank you very much. My question is going to be directed to Mr. Bandeau and Ms. Steigerwald. At the risk of a potentially gross understatement of your views, at least part of your objections, if you will, to mandatory service is the idea that the federal government would be particularly effective at selecting what types of service would be appropriate for particular individuals. Earlier today, at our earlier panel, we had a testimony from an individual, Professor Dr. Grimm from University of Maryland, who talked about some very creative programs where individuals who have some experience in how to think about service can generate some very interesting, innovative types of things. I wonder if you could tell me, would you be more inclined to support, and now we may talk about, a generation out, the idea of a mandatory service if it were something that enabled individuals to design and to implement service in a way that would be responsive to things that they're passionate about and that are needs in their community? Ms. Steigerwald?
Well, again, you're stressing sort of the more voluntary choice-based side, but obviously, as I think you all gather by now, I have a fundamental objection to this on a principle. But I will say also that your idea sounds nice and very self-directed, but high school students don't even get to do that now with their general education. And I sort of can't believe that it could be as self-directed, independent study-like as you optimistically describe. So I'm not seeing it working out that way. And fundamentally, I don't think that the lessons being imparted are ones that young people should learn. That they shouldn't learn that they belong to the state, even in a sort of more gentle capacity.
I can certainly imagine that a process could be developed that would be more efficient. Though, I mean, if one sees how the military assigns people and where they go, I mean, this is at times a very arbitrary process. You put in your preferences, it's rankings, it's where you've been, it's points. My father ended up as a meteorologist because his half-brother showed up in the office of the guy who was doing assignments and said he shouldn't be in the motor pool. Why don't you try meteorology? My dad ends up as a weatherman. Maybe the process under this kind of a program would be better. On the other hand, if we're talking 4 or 8 million people, and again, to me, and then who is running these? Who's using them? It's not just assigning. It's every NGO, it's state agencies. And are we creating new agencies? Are we relying on state agencies? Are we relying on existing NGOs? How do they change their operations knowing that we may get free labor? And so to me, however well designed, I'm very skeptical this will turn out. But I don't see an argument for mandatory service. To say that mandatory service might be less burdensome, to me, does not change the fact that genuine service needs to be voluntary. That, there is no compulsory compassion. This is not something that should be forced. There are moral duties that we should teach, but these are not political duties that should be enforced by the state, whether it means cutting benefits or throwing people in jail. And again, consider the idea of throwing people into jail because they refuse to show up to shelf books in a library. Is that really what we view the reach of the state should be? That is what we are talking about if we're talking about the ultimate sanction of the criminal law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. O'Lark. This has been an excellent panel. It certainly personifies that for which we exist in America. And we don't all agree. I mean, I've been married over 30 years and yet to win a battle. So I see a lot of that here. But we do have pros and cons. And I would love to get your opinions as to, are there areas that you may of service, military, national, public, whatever. Are there areas where you could potentially see mandatory service? And are there areas that you four could agree upon being voluntary service? I'll open that up.
I'll start off. I don't think we were not talking about making.
Just pull the microphone.
Oh, excuse me. We were not talking about making any specific part of the program mandatory. I think we were all, or at least at the outset, we were talking about options. And so I wouldn't make civilian service option mandatory. I wouldn't make the military service option mandatory, but I would make something mandatory. For example, in the program that I espouse, the civilian service also includes humanitarian aid overseas. Now, I don't think anybody could argue with the fact that that would be properly done, money well spent. To me, sending our most valuable resource, our youth, over to help a foreign country or help outside of our own nation, to help them with any threat or problem that they have, is a lot more important than just sending money, which usually gets sidetracked to the autocrats that run the country, or just inefficiently used and whatnot. And again, I wouldn't make the humanitarian aid part of it mandatory. I wouldn't. The only part that would be mandatory, the way I see it, would be whatever the military at the time needs to suit their requirements. And right now, as was mentioned earlier by some, the military is hurting. They're not getting enough volunteers now, and one of the reasons being, or one of the reasons that they don't have enough soldiers, sailors, Marines, and so on, is that so much of our youth is not qualified to serve now either because of mental deficiency, physical deficiencies, and so on. So I would make the military mandatory, but the mandatory part would be, you gotta do something.
Any other thoughts?
Well, this is not so much a thought as an analogy. I think it's helpful. In principle, we could probably staff all of the juries in the country with volunteers. And some of the same people would show up over and over again. We don't do it that way. And I think for good and sufficient reason we don't do it that way. And for the civic consequences of doing it in a mandatory way, if I could assign one piece of reading for this, this august commission, it would be Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of the civic consequences of mandatory jury duty. So, as a general proposition, anything that is sort of like jury duty, I think has at least a prima facie case for being distributed in the population, through the population in ways other than simple voluntary individual choices would produce.
To me, the only claim for mandatory service would be attributes of sovereignty of the state, of the essential framework of free society. America needs to be defended in a dangerous world. The good news is the U.S., in my view, stands apart. We stand apart from everybody extraordinary, with a geographic position as well as extraordinary military. So I don't see what that need would be. I'm pressed hard to find a circumstance that would require that we would face an existential threat that could be stemmed by mass conscription. It strikes me the only argument that one can imagine, to my mind, for a mandatory service would be that kind of an existential threat to the U.S. society. I think jury duty is another, you can argue, is an attribute of sovereignty in terms of the judicial system that is necessary for the United States. I don't believe one can make that argument on civilian service, which again, to me, is service to individuals. It's worthwhile, I think it's moral, but I don't think it's an attribute of sovereignty. I don't think it's the business of the state to make that a political obligation.
Thank you. Dr. Davidson?
So, at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to what one's personal views are about the role of government and about, since you mentioned Tocqueville, civil society and what it takes to have a robust and healthy and strong civil society and a democracy. Ms. Steigerwald, you said something about people helping people. I'm assuming you meant it in a good way. People should help people. So I'm wondering, is there a role for education and government in promoting the idea of people helping people, whether it's, you said civic responsibility, which is more obligatory in its connotation, versus civic engagement, which is more voluntary. Either way, we raise our children with a certain set of understandings about the way our government works and our society works. So what would be the role of education in helping our children understand the value of civic engagement or people helping people, or if you don't think those two things are the same?
I definitely don't think those two things are the same. You also asked that question of somebody who was homeschooled to show my former education hand. So, but I mean, theoretically, of all the things that public schools do and all the problems that I think they have, sort of, if you could impart that charity is good, I mean that's nice. But churches do that. the golden rule. Like, there's a lot of Christian types who live up to, what they believe is their religious duty. People are very generous, and I don't think we really talk about that enough. We should talk about the people who are going without, but we should sort of celebrate all the good things that people do without being forced to do it. I mean, parents are the first influence in most children's life, and you have to hope that they are imparting values that, gel with charitable goodness, generosity. But if you don't have the right to be a selfish jerk, you don't really have you don't have your rights. And it has to come down to a choice and a level of engagement. I mean, if we were all the most generous people possible, we would all be working for Doctors Without Borders right now or something, or we would have given all of our money to charity. And so everybody draws a limit somewhere to their generosity, and it's sort of self-evident that that has to come from an individual whose money it is, whose time it is, and things like that.
Well, it certainly makes sense for our schools to do moral and civic education. I think the challenge becomes who is in control and how centralized is it. I mean, if you look at American education, there was a time where American states wanted to make sure that we didn't have private education, such as Washington State, because of all those papists who were showing up as kind of undesirables who were going to suddenly have their own communities and teach the wrong religion. The dominant religion was kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. We wanted that as the civic religion, and boy, that is going to be taught by public schools. And we will do exactly as much as we can to ensure there are alternatives. And that was part of the ethos. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court that said, you cannot ban private education. To me, that is a critical element of saying you've got to have alternatives and opportunities. So I would say that when we're looking at education, to me, again, I don't like the idea of it starting in Washington as a dictate that goes out. To me, what you want is an educational system that is diverse, where there are opportunities, and where there are going to be some schools out there I don't like in terms of the approaches they take, but as long as we have an open system and competing opportunities, then I think this is where a lot of the education is going to have to come from. It is a challenge, because if the right people are on top, then we're very happy with the education that is taught. But if our friends aren't in power anymore, then suddenly we find other values and other views would be cast. I think this is one we want to be very careful of. That education, this needs to be part of a larger civic process of socialization, which is family and community, church, and a lot of things. And we do have problems and breakdown of institutions that makes it harder at times.
Well, I'd like to note for the record that Mr. Vandal and I have just reached a point of agreement that appears to be Society of Sisters was correctly decided by the Supreme Court. So, okay, so Commissioner Larkin, you finally haven't answered your question. But to return to the education question for just a minute, granting the importance of a diversity of educational opportunities, public and private, and sectarian as well as secular in the private sphere, which I've argued for passionately. I also think there is an argument for a general national requirement of a certain basic knowledge of the American political system, the way it works, imparted through all primary and secondary schools, private as well as public. When I was in the White House, I tried to get the National Assessment of Educational Progress broadened to include an annual or a biennial test in basic civic knowledge. I'm not talking about indoctrinating anyone with libertarianism or my form of liberalism or Bernie Sanders' form of democratic socialism. Just knowing the basics. And I think that that is a legitimate goal of education, public and private. And if the government were to require the same kind of assessment of civic knowledge that we now require for English and math, I don't think that would be a deprivation of liberty that we ought to worry about. perhaps from a libertarian point of view it is.
So the difference, I think, in values and in facts.
Well, I agree with that, and that's why I'm stressing the cognitive, factual dimension of the American political system.
Ms. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hollander, my question is for you. Most mandatory national service proposals, including your own, I believe, envision a cohort of young people serving the country for a period of time. It's been suggested to us through research that there's actually some tangible benefits of service on an individual's health, for example, has a positive effect on an individual's health. So how do you envision including other age cohorts in service proposals? So, for example, children and seniors, and not just the younger cohort that we've been talking about.
Sure. That is a negative in the program that, as I have presented it, and I think we definitely have to address it now. Let's take a look at the situation that exists now and the situation as I have discussed it. 18 and 19-year-olds will not be qualified to serve, for example, in the Peace Corps for obvious reasons. They could get a temporary exemption if they wish to go right into college, assuming they could commit in a legal fashion to serve in the Peace Corps or some other qualified service that wouldn't take somebody who only has an 18-year-old education. So with that type of approach, you could step it up from the 18-year-olds and get up into the lower 20s, mid-20s, and so on. That's one approach to broadening the availability of the service opportunities. The available opportunities that the Commission currently envisions, if we get into a program of this nation, would be broadly advertised to the population in general, and therefore would encourage those who are beyond their 18th birthday or their 24th birthday or what have you, would encourage them to serve. If we have a universal program of some sort, organizations such as Senior Corps would be involved, and Senior Corps would be positioned either financially or in other ways to offer more opportunities for seniors. I think if there is a culture of service that starts with the youngsters, it'll just automatically bleed out to other age groups. And of course, eventually, if we just offer it to 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds, eventually everyone will have served in some fashion, and therefore their youngsters will want to serve, and the program that perhaps got off to a slow start would grow and be available for more age groups. That will take a generation or a couple of generations. We look now, for example, getting back to the seniors, in a lot of small towns, not from a small town in Connecticut, I think a lot of the towns have the same problem that our town has, that the commissions and organizations that are providing services to the town on either as elected official or more likely in a voluntary position. Those positions are pretty much being filled now by older folks like myself. And we find in our town, and I know other small towns have the same problem, that the young folk are not stepping up or not volunteering. Their time is spent raising a family or getting involved in other youth sports activities, that type of thing. But those youngsters are not getting involved. Seniors are involved, and I think we've got to get all the youngsters involved, and including young young folks in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to get more involved. And I think we get a program that we're talking about that will lead out to these other goals.
Thank you.
Mr. Kilgannon.
Thank you. Mr. Hollander, for what it's worth, I had you pegged for the youth cohort. But, Mr. Van Dam, as we traveled around the country, obviously we met with a lot of military. And like you, they voiced support for the all-volunteer force. However, many of them did voice a concern that they felt that they were doing more than the average citizen, pulling their weight more than the average person. Is that something we should be concerned about, and what should we do about it?
Well, they certainly are. You go back to the Iraq War, we turned reservists into substitutes for active duty, pulled them out repeatedly out of their jobs, their communities, and their family situations. It's really not what they signed up for. Multiple tours of duty, we turn lieutenants and captains into basically borough chiefs and heads of townships, and are supposed to negotiate with local tribal leaders. We're expecting them to run societies and rebuild countries. And that's really, our military has been trained very well to do what needs to be done in terms of winning very serious wars. I think there are two issues, one of which is, as has been mentioned earlier, the lack of decision makers having military experience. But part of that is simply the reality we take in the recruits every year under 200,000. If you have 4 million people turning 18, that means that the vast majority of your population will not have military experience, just won't. And even if we tried to draft, the point is that doesn't mean that everyone will equally have serious military duty. That is, the historic experience is if you have a college education, you're more likely to be the company clerk than you are to be out in combat arms. If you have military connections and influential parents, you're much more likely to find yourself out of harm's way than in harm's way in those kind of situations. So there's no easy answer in terms of that. It certainly would help that if we had politicians whose ethic was not, well, I had other priorities, when the war was on, but then when they are in power, they're quite busy coming up with new places to send American forces, and we certainly have had that with a number of officials. I think the real issue here is what we use the military for. And we've got to ask, is it worth the sacrifice of lives, of injuries, what it does to families, in terms of the goals that we have set in some places? To me, we no longer view the military and the war as the last resort. We view it as the first resort. We have a very good hammer, and everything around the world looks like a nail. And to my mind, Ted mentions our allies. Well, the Germans spend 1.2% of GDP on the military. Why the F do we defend them? If they can't be bothered. Fine. The question is, why do we, 70 years after the end of World War II, have to carry a burden for people who seem somewhat less concerned about some of the issues? So I think what you raised there is an extraordinarily important issue. But I think that we have to look at it from the other side. The conscription would not be the answer. It's a question of what are we doing with young people? Why are we putting them at risk? Where, as I mentioned, my nephew is a SEAL. My family has had a lot of military service. I want these people to have sufficient manpower and material behind them for anything we send them out to do. But let's make sure if we send them out, it's for an extraordinarily important purpose.
Are you suggesting that if we did not intervene militarily, that more young people would be inclined to join the military?
What I'd say is that we actually would need less people in the military. The more you want to do, the larger the force structure you have to have. Military spending is the price of your foreign policy. If you want an activist foreign policy, if you want to defend rich allies, rebuild failed societies, intervene in civil wars, and other sorts of things, you need force structure. So we just have, you can't do it on the cheap. And I think that's kind of what we've been trying to do, cut military spending but still do everything. So to my mind, if we're worried about the burden on forces and we're worried about not having some of the decision makers having that experience but putting a lot of pressure on people in the military, let's ask what we're having them do and decide, is that really necessary? We need to look at both ends. We can't just look at one end, we've got to look at the second end.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Hollander, you stated in your testimony that you would step back from your position that service had to be mandatory if you were convinced that a program like the Serve America Together effort led by the Service Year Alliance, which is universal service, really could accomplish the goal through benefits and penalties. In your opinion, what benefits would be necessary or penalties to accomplish a goal of universal service that isn't mandatory but really encourage people to want to participate?
I'm not sure where we'd have to draw the line. Obviously, if you gave everybody free college service and so on and so forth, you would get more encouragement. If you give them a $100 credit toward their tuition, you'd get less. And the problem is exacerbated by the fact that those who are less fortunate and come from a less educated social situation don't really have the pathway, if you will, to take advantage of the benefits that we might offer. If you took somebody who now is on the street corner struggling to make a buck and support himself, let alone his family, getting into all sorts of, or any sort of antisocial behavior and whatnot, and said to him, if you volunteer and get into the Army or some civilian service program, we can help you out with your college education, or we can make sure that you get additional credits, or when you stand in line trying to get a job with industry, we can see that our program will see you get the head of the line. I don't think that would sink in at all. It's just something that would probably be, let's speak another language, to a certain group of the underprivileged in this country. So I don't know where the benefits would be. Obviously, they would certainly help if the benefits were sufficient. It would help a good deal of society, but it wouldn't help everybody. So it wouldn't really serve us getting to it would help get to the universal service aspect, but it wouldn't really get us there. As far as the penalties, obviously, when we start out, if the penalty was imprisonment or something, that obviously would be a deterrent to not participating. I'm not suggesting that. Again, I don't know where we would draw the line.
Dr. Nelson, do you have thoughts on this? In AmeriCorps originally had the education award, which now is roughly for a semester. It's now come into a program. Would you change the benefits at all for a service program? Also, it doesn't really appeal to young people who aren't college bound, which there are a number.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and masquerade as an expert on how AmeriCorps has changed over the past 25 years, but I will take your word for it that the educational benefit is now the equivalent of a semester. If so, that's too small. First of all, I don't think it's fair compensation, and secondly, I don't think it's a very effective incentive. I would also, by analogy, in many think tanks in town, there's a debate about unpaid internships as having a class skew, that only certain kinds of people are going to be able to take up that opportunity. I'm in favor, in the voluntary service sector, of which AmeriCorps is part, of doing everything that is reasonable and within our power to make sure that opportunities that are offered are equally available and attractive to young people up and down the income spectrum. I think that's very, very important. Otherwise, what you're simply doing is replicating advantages that people enter into and come in with, and not only that, you're making it much more likely that your service is going to be conducted with people from the same stratum of society that you've been a member of all your life. And if I can add a note of personal experience from military service, I was drafted into the Marines. Yes, they did that behind the Vietnam War. I ended up as a clerk in an office, but I spent 2 years with people that I never otherwise would have met. It was a transformative experience, not because I was in a foxhole with them, but because I was with them 24/7. So I wouldn't underestimate the consequences of this kind of mixing for the broadening of the experience base of members of the elite, which, somewhat to my surprise, I turned out to be.
Because that was a benefit as opposed to a reason for having conscription at that time.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think you would probably agree with me that one of the consequences of the ADF is to make the political costs of entering stupid wars much lower than they otherwise would be.
But you can stop stupid wars by not realistic. And if the military has trouble maintaining the size of its force while fighting a stupid war, it is paying a direct price, as opposed to in conscription where the machine just moves on for years and years providing soldiers.
Oh, that gets you.
You're right.
Let's go back to Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Van Al, I think at least once, perhaps twice, you expressed some concern about regarding things that impact primary, secondary education, about, I think, demonstrably, federal government reaching down into localities and how my word fraught that is. I don't disagree, and I also think there's a degree of expected impracticality with perhaps a rigidity in federal control over a local level. But I'd like to ask you, with the, from that concern that you have, are there examples of programs where the federal government facilitates things that occur at a local level, state and or local level, where we find it to be beneficial / or just well done or suitably done?
Well, I'd certainly say the objective of trying to increase the equity of funding among school districts makes a lot of sense. I think it's very hard to do for a whole host of reasons. I think using property taxes to fund local schools is awful, because it's very much in terms of how the funding goes. The area of wealthier is going to spend an awful lot more than the area of lack of wealth. And certainly there are federal programs that attempt to direct resources at schools, especially in inner cities and elsewhere. And I think conceptually that is an attempt. The problem that strikes me on education is it's so much more state and local responsibility. But to me, that's the sort of thing I would say, yeah, there's a specific problem where there's a targeted attempt to reach it and to deal with it.
How about areas beyond just education, where the federal government extends its reach to a local level?
Oh, I mean, there are often, one of the problems, of course, is there's a massive funding programs that, for the most part, I mean, localities, are happy to use for their own use, and they're very political. So I think that there's a lot of good intentions expressed, but in practice, things. I mean, you look at some of the economic development programs that I think, for the most part, are pretty awful in terms of how they turn out. And in terms of social services, I mean, I'm saying Medicaid. I mean, how do you try to ensure a level of health care for the poorest citizens of America, especially in states that are poorer than others? You have a program that shares funding. I mean, I think, again, conceptually, that's something that makes sense. Unfortunately, poor people don't get very good care out of it. But to me, that would be one that I would point to and say there's an attempt at meeting a specific need that's very clear, that's very real, that is hard for states to manage, or it would be hard for localities to manage. The feds come in at least as a partner, and there's a shared responsibility. I mean, I think that makes some sense.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. That concludes our second rounds of questions. I'd like to thank Mr. Panda, Dr. Galston, Mr. Hollander, and Ms. Steigerwald for being here. We greatly appreciate your time today, and thank you for providing valuable information to the Commission. I will now dismiss the panelists, but you're welcome to take the seats that are reserved there up front if you'd like to stay for the remainder of the hearing, and invite the public to provide comments. The Commission is committed to transparency and openness with the public. In keeping with these principles, the Commission intends to provide the public with an opportunity to deliver public comments during our hearings. As a reminder, in order to provide the greatest opportunity for as many participants to offer a comment as would like, public comment is limited to a 2-minute period per person. As is noted on our website, sign up for public comment took place between the opening of registration and the start of this hearing. When you signed up, you received a numbered ticket. To ensure fairness, tickets were randomly drawn. We will call out 5 ticket numbers at a time. Today, we only have 4, so it'll be easy. And ask that when your number is called, please line up to my right, your left, along that wall. The numbers in order are ticket number 4, 1, 3, and 2. So if you please sign up there for 1, 3, and 2. Additionally, if you have any written statements that you would like to submit for the record, please provide them to staff at the registration desk. During your comment, please be aware of the lights that are in front of U on this table. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds remaining and red when time has expired. Please introduce yourself to the commission with your name and affiliation before starting your comment. You are recognized for 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Joe Schuman. I work for a Department of Defense innovation organization that's promoting national service across DoD. I'm actually here in a personal capacity as a National Guardsman who struggled during the military accessions process to get into service. So I was happy to hear the panelists talk about expanding access to service because I know the military medical accessions process keeps tens of thousands of interested applicants who want to get into uniform out every year. And just as an example of my case, I was an MIT engineer by training, always wanted to serve, had service in my family, but had a history of spinal fusion surgeries for scoliosis, which is obviously a medical condition that the military might want to keep out. It doesn't affect me anyway, but basically because of that red flag on my record, I had been rejected 3 times for military service from the Army, the Navy, and the Army Guard. And I only mention this because I have met since then dozens of other applicants personally with similar situations who could serve, who are ready to serve and willing to serve, but unable to because of the military process.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here for offering your comment today. Appreciate it. Thank you. Ticket number 1. If you come forward, please. State your name and affiliation for the record, and you are recognized for 2 minutes.
My name is Paul Jacob. I'm president of Liberty Initiative Fund, although they're not necessarily affiliated with my remarks. Americans need to know that their Congress, through this commission, is considering the possibility of drafting young Americans, young people, my kids, and forcing them against their will into government service. We are here today, I think sadly, tragically, and frighteningly, because the subject of this hearing is should service be mandatory? My answer is emphatically no. No involuntary servitude, period. And I feel like deep down, this commission agrees. You as commissioners agree with that view. Why do I think this? Well, because I noticed that your website says Inspire to Serve. That's your web address. And I know the excellent people that are working for you, that I've communicated with, their emails come in, and that email address says Inspire to Serve. Now, that's noble. That's good. But I suspect you wouldn't want an email address that said forcedtoserve.gov or said drafttoserve.gov or conscripttoserve.gov or drag out of their homes and force them into government service to do routine government work.gov, which of course is probably too long anyway. Provided this commission decides to recommend no draft, then Inspire to Serve is a perfect web address. It fits, it makes sense. But if this commission has any thought to suggesting to the Congress that they should pass a compulsory law to force young people into labor to the government against their will, well then that web address doesn't work at all. That web address would be a lie. I beseech this commission forswear any forced service whatsoever. That shouldn't happen in America. And I ask you, before you consider recommending that we have forced service for young people, change your web address. Change your email addresses to Forced to Serve, even for a week or 2. See what it feels like to be part of a commission that is no longer inspired to serve, but is instead, we are going to make you serve against your will. that will not be inspiring.
Thank you, sir, for your comment.
Thank you.
Ticket number 3. Please state your name for the record and any affiliation before beginning your comments, and you're recognized for 2 minutes.
I'm Kendra Bradley. I'm Executive Director of Quaker House in Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of Fort Bragg. When I talk about this mandatory service requirement, I assume that you're referring to some sort of paid service, at least a stipend, living arrangement, something. There's a lot of value in unpaid, but I assume you're talking about that. And America loves their market-driven economy. And these sectors, are driven by pay, benefits, stability, and the work environment. Yet our civil government service members have been furloughed recently. Military housing has been in the news recently for having housing in shambles. It's just a shame. And military families that are on SNAP benefits because they cannot feed their families otherwise. Those are all disincentives. If you make service mandatory, you're taking out that market incentive. There is no incentive to improve these conditions. And I would anticipate the conditions would only continue to get worse. I attended a public hearing in Harrisburg last year, and we heard the VISTA volunteers tell you that the only way that they were able to do that was because they were basically subsidized by their families. Because they were privileged enough, lucky enough to be born into a family that they could do that. And it was noted in your executive summary of what you've heard so far. And I was happy to see that. It was kind of laughed at when somebody mentioned a free education. And, maybe education benefits are benefit afterwards. However, if you don't have a free education, or at least free interest-free student loans, then some people can enter Peace Corps, some people can enter AmeriCorps, or Teach for America, and the rest are forced, whether they want to or not, to enter the biggest, largest employer in the public sector that will take them, which is the military. Now, as a Quaker, violating somebody's conscience because they literally have no other choice to fulfill your mandatory requirement, I don't think you understand maybe how deeply that sense of conscience is held. And I would urge you to respect that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ticket number 2. Again, please state your name for the record and any affiliation, and you are recognized for 2 minutes.
My name is Paul Seeger. I'm a retired federal employee. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, distinguished commissioners, thank you for this opportunity to address the commission. On January 14th of this year, I had an op-ed published in the New York Daily News on my support for mandatory national service. I feel very strongly about the issue. I submitted a copy to the commission at that time. I'd like to split my comments today into 2 sections, one philosophical and the other practical. Philosophically, there's nothing that unites Americans today, no shared common experience. To me, that is a recipe for division and ultimately the fracturing of this country into several different entities. Demographic changes, if nothing else, will be the principal drivers of this fracturing. One way to forestall this development is to introduce a common shared experience, mandatory national service, the type of activity that has long been demonstrated to bring people together and expose more people to more opportunities. On the practical side, with regard to program specifics, 1 to 2 years of service between the ages of 18 and 28 will provide flexibility for all participants to select the time frame that best meets their circumstances. To address the question of what's in it for me, I believe all participants should be eligible for benefits to help with education and other expenses, similar to the GI Bill. Implementing a program of this size would probably best be accomplished over a period of years to allow for periodic reviews and adjustments. President Kennedy, who famously encouraged Americans to serve their country, also proposed the extraordinary challenge of putting a man on the moon. He allowed for nearly a decade to achieve this with numerous milestones to be met along the way. This program could also be structured in that way. Mandatory service would be a public-private partnership. Corporate America should be asked to fund the majority of the costs, to be administered by the Corporation for National and Community Service. Many corporations already contribute to service programs, as we heard this morning from IBM. Retired baby boomers could serve as valuable mentors to program participants. Challenges and objections, I believe, there are none that are insurmountable. Mandatory national service is not a panacea, but it has the power to be transformational. We need to think big and plan long-term to help bring us together as a nation as we face the challenges ahead. I believe mandatory national service will move us in that direction. Thank you very much.
And if you could provide the copy of the written testimony to staff. Thank you. So we have gone through all of the tickets that we had for public comment. Just a minute, ma'am. We have gone through all the tickets which we had for public comments, but still have time remaining for this hearing. At this time, if you are unable to put your name on a ticket because you arrived late or have been inspired to share a public comment during our hearing, please come up to the microphone now. If you have already shared a public comment during this hearing, please do not come back forward. This time is intended for individuals who are not accounted for during the ticket drawings. Comments will be taken first come, first served until the end of our allotted hearing time. So if there's anybody yet who has not pulled a ticket, please come forward, state your name for the record, and you are recognized for 2 minutes.
Thanks for this commission. My name is Li Yang. Actually, I tried to get contact with the front desk, and he just asked me to come here. As I say, my name is Li Yang. I actually came to the United States in the mid-60s after I get a BA from Taiwan, and I passed 3 distinguished test examination, so I should have a very promising career. And I thought if I can come to the United States to get an MA, PhD, I'll be glad to travel around the world to help what I think can be helped. Unfortunately, or should I say maybe fortunately, probably somebody said this is 1 out of million to be able to do that. So I got stuck in the United States. And I have ample opportunity to observe the problem. So I hope this commission to devote your effort to educate people, to unite your family. The problem now is the family are taken apart, so their assets, their productivity are diminished. So even if you volunteer for a VA, you are promising for all the benefits. Those social benefits are not going to benefit them because they are victimized to benefit those what I call, you can link this word, tribalism, official misconduct, government gain, abuse, murder, fraud, crime, injustice network, because this is a combination all together, a system-wide. So I really hope in order to fight this, you have to increase not only those youngsters' productivity, bring the family together so your asset will be stay together, so you will not be robbed. So those racial profiling, police brutality, or any mental health problem, those are really basically false, fake. So if we can do this together, we help the productivity, we really change the system, otherwise there's no hope. So I really think my effort should benefit the whole society, and because I am a victim, and my family is a victim, my family are supposed to be very happy, healthy, millionaire. But now we come to a penniless, and my 2 children, now although they are go through MIT, but before them, they are level inferior, they are the level that's unhealthy. So I just think this society is very sick. You must do something.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your comments. Are there any other members of the public present today who have not been able to offer a public comment and would like to do so at this time? Okay, seeing none, I again want to thank our panelists for providing their testimony today and all of those in attendance who took the time to be here at today's proceedings. We have heard from thousands of Americans over the course of the last year as we traveled around the country. We need to hear from thousands more because we want to make sure that any recommendations that we put forward to the President, to Congress, and the American people truly are reflective of the diverse demographics that make up this great country. If you have other comments that you would like to provide after leaving here today, we invite you to submit them via our website, inspire2serve.gov. That's inspire, the number 2, as was pointed out, serve.gov. We will be collecting public comments through December 31st of this year. It is only with your help and input that the Commission will achieve its vision of every American inspired and eager to serve. There being no further business before this Commission, this hearing is adjourned.